So I want to say to everyone, first of all, happy Constitution Day. We are very excited to bring this programming honoring the 234th signing of the Constitution today, 234 years ago. I am Nicole Chalet. I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, also known as the AHA Society. And I'm very glad you join us today for a conversation about the Constitution and its little known cover letter. But before I introduce this evening's speakers, I do want to make a note that this is also a special event because this is the first time that many of us are coming together after the unexpected passing of our past president and founder, Rand Chalet. And so we thank you all for being here today and remembering him. And it's also auspicious that this event is being held on September 17th because it was 10 years ago today that Rand Chalet met fellow founders and board members of the AHA Society, Mariana Aller and Dr. Thomas Aller. And so it's really quite a remarkable full circle moment that over the last 10 years, the AHA Society has grown to become a national organization dedicated to education about Alexander Hamilton and his life and legacy, and also really beautiful full circle moment that among many of our initiatives, we are the nonprofit partners to Hamilton Grange, celebrating 10 years ago today, its reopening to the public after a massive restoration. And so without further ado, we'll jump right into this fascinating topic. And I would like to introduce Sergio Villavicencio, the Vice President of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and Adam Levinson, the founder of Statutesandstories.com, and they will be sharing us the fascinating story behind the cover letter of the Constitution. Sergio, Adam, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I will let you take it away as I know you have a lot of fascinating information to share with us.
So first of all, go ahead, Sergio.
Happy Constitution Day. I think I stole your words. In order to get to the cover letter of the Constitution, which is a largely forgotten document, unfortunately, we really think that we have to start by telling the story of how everything happened and unfolded in order to get there. So we wanted to start from the Articles of Confederation, which actually led the country for 12 years, from 1777 till 1789, in which the new constitution was adopted. And while the Articles of Confederation had a lot of strength in them, they had also some flaws and fatal holes, if you want to call it that way, that led to an understanding and realization that there was a need to change them, and not only change them, but to replace them with a whole different type of government. Adam, would you like to talk a little bit about the strengths and some of the flaws of the Articles of Confederation?
And Sergio, I agree with you. And let me throw out a number. It's the 234th anniversary of the Constitution. So happy birthday. And let me give some numbers when we talk about the Articles. So the Articles of Confederation, or the Articles of Perpetual Union, and we can debate about when does it actually take effect. And this gets to some of the weaknesses of the Articles. So the Articles were proposed and they started drafting them in 1776. And everybody knows the date, 1776, because of the Declaration. So they started working on them in 1776. They finished drafting them in 1777, and they send them to the states because it has to get ratified. And you need all the states to ratify them. It's not until 1781 that Maryland, which is the last state, finally ratifies. So they're sort of in a never Alice in Wonderland kind of, they're sort of operating under the Articles, but it's not official until 1781. And Sergio is exactly correct that the Articles get replaced by the Constitution when the Constitution takes effect in 1789. So you asked about the weaknesses and the strengths. And I like to describe the Articles as more of it's a loose confederation. And the key here is that sovereignty was with the states. So if you look at Article 2, for example, of the Articles of Confederation, it says very clearly that each state retains its sovereignty. The states are in charge. They retain their sovereignty, their freedom, and their independence. And Article 3 makes it even more clear that it's a league, a firm league of friendship. So what else can we talk about the Articles? And you know, this is coming out during the war. So the states are not only distrustful of England, but they're distrustful of each other. And the last thing they want to do is give lots of power to Congress, because the king was the bad guy. And if you give too much power to Congress, then you're creating another king. And there are all kinds of conversations that we could have about that. So what else? So it's a unicameral. There's
I think that's an excellent point what you're saying, because the Articles of Confederation were perfect during the war, but they were not necessarily the best type of government once you were trying to run a nation and have that. And there were a lot of problems with that. For example, Congress did not have the power to tax and did not have the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. There was also a problem that there was no executive branch, and there was no national court system or judicial branch, if you want to call it. And then militarily, it was also a problem, right, Adam?
Absolutely. So the Articles was a wartime alliance. It worked. It won the war. In fact, there are professors out there, and Professor Kaminsky, one of my favorite professors of all time, and maybe we'll talk about him later today. You know, he goes into a discussion about counterfactuals. You know, what if certain things were done, we might still be living under the Articles. So there are advantages and disadvantages, and maybe we'll talk about some of the things that were accomplished. But I always love to use Hamilton quotes. That way, it's not just what do I think, it's, you know, what do the founders have to say? So one of my favorite Hamilton quotes about the Articles, and this is a letter that he writes to George Washington on March 24th of 1783. So this is as we know that the war is coming to an end. We're waiting for the treaty from Paris, which takes a while. So this is what he says. He laments to George Washington of the arduous work, and he borrows a figure from mechanics, from science. And this is what he says. He says, the centrifugal is much stronger than the centripetal force in these states, and the seeds of disunion much more numerous than those of union. So Hamilton is using a scientific metaphor here that the centrifugal forces that are going to force the states to pull apart, and when you don't have the glue of the British that were a common enemy. So that's just one example from Hamilton's perspective. And he diagnoses this very early on, the defects under the Articles, which was a want of power in Congress. George
Washington particularly, and a lot of the nationalists. And when I use the term nationalist, I'm not using it with the nowadays connotation. Now, nationalists, as opposed to, if you will, localist. Nationalists in the sense that they were looking for a united identity under a single nation, and they were looking for a united nations. At the time, there was really nothing united about United States. There were nothing really united about the United States. Like Adam said earlier, there was a lot of distrust between the states. And as we can see later, some of the smaller states actually were more distrusting of being under the power of larger states than being under the power of a central government. And that is something that is really interesting. But George Washington actually said, we're either a united people or we're not. If we are not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to it.
And some people like to think that Washington was a quiet guy and he sort of just supervises. And that's not true, because when you read his correspondence, he's getting letters back and forth with Madison and with the Secretary of War. We'll talk about Henry Knox, and of course with Hamilton. So here's an example. This is Washington writing to the governor of Virginia. His name was Benjamin Harrison in 1784. And this is Washington writing that we are a half-starved, limping government that appears always moving on crutches and tottering at every step. This is 1784. Then he writes to Secretary of War Henry Knox that who besides a Tory could have foreseen, in other words, who other than the enemies could have foreseen the problems that we're having. He says, notwithstanding the boasted virtue of America, we're so proud of America, but we are far gone in everything ignoble and bad. So he's beginning to realize things are not working out as we had promised. We fought so hard for this war. We don't want to be losing the peace. Here, I'll give you one more. This is Washington to Madison. Washington writes, we've got 13 sovereignties pulling against each other, tugging at the federal head, meaning the federal government will soon bring ruin to the whole. And we could go on. And I encourage people, look at some of these primary sources, not what I think or others necessarily on the panel, but read what the founders had to say. And you can see they understood, and particularly Hamilton. And Hamilton understood this back in 1780 to see some of these problems, and he anticipated some of these problems.
There were two particular things that happened that precipitated that not only the fact that the Constitutional Convention happened, but also the fact that many people changed their minds when it came to having a complete replacement of this type of government that was present. And one of them was the impost. Can you talk about the impost, Adam?
The impost, and this is terminology that today most Americans don't know what we're talking about. What is the impost? Are we talking about a blog post? What's an impost? So there are different names we could use for taxes, right? And taxes is a dirty word because people don't like taxes. But long story short, the government owes a lot of money. Wars are not cheap. So an impost is a tax. And the proposal that was made starting in 1781, and we can go into a lot of detail on this, but it's boring if we do too much about taxes. So an impost is a tax. And this is one of the solutions that was proposed in 1781. And it's a tariff is another word for it, a tariff on goods that are being imported into the country. So one of the problems with the articles is you needed all states to agree to amend them. And when you created taxing authority for Congress, that would require an amendment to the articles, because the way the articles wrote, you could only do what was called a requisition, where the states could ask, or the federal government could ask the states for money. And then if the federal government was nice enough and the states were going to comply, then the federal government would get given money by the 13 states. So those are called requisitions. The problem is the states didn't want to give money or enough money. They were always falling behind. So the requisitions from the states were inadequate to fund the federal government. So they try in 1781, and of course Hamilton is involved with this along with Madison, because these are the group, and I agree with you, Sergio, that it's appropriate to call them nationalists as they use that term. So someone who wanted a more energetic government, that's one of the words, a more energetic federal government, a federal government that had resources that could deliver on these promises, would support the impost of 1781. And as I said, 12 states agreed except for Rhode Island. And it's curious, there are all kinds of names they came up with, and some are more polite than others. So Rogue Island is an example of one of the names.
And it's important to mention that under the Articles of Confederation, you needed to have, you had to be unanimous in everything that you did. That therefore, one single state that did not approve with what everybody wanted to do could just destroy everything that people were working for. And that's the case that happened to the impost. They
do all this work to get this impost, a 5% tariff, approved. All the states agree except for the last holdout state, Rhode Island, which does the veto, which kills it in 1782. So they try again in 1783. They make a couple amendments to make it more palatable. They limit it to 25-year duration. They limit it that it's only paying off debts, not that the federal government should be able to use this money for other purposes. So they put all kinds of limitations around it. All the states approve it except for one. This time Rhode Island approves it, and it's, of all places, New York that says no. So New York is the one that kills the impost in 1786, which is a story in and of itself.
We mentioned one, and I earlier mentioned there were two particular things that precipitated this, and the second one was Shays Rebellion. And for those who are not familiar with Shays Rebellion, Daniel Shays was a landless farmer who also fought, and I believe he made it all the way to captain during the Revolutionary War. The problem was that he did not get paid for all the years of service. When he came back to his farm, he was swimming in debt. And then the local government was not able, or pretty much did not want to give any kind of debt relief. And that created a lot of problem for a lot of people like him, that not only were not paid, but felt that they were being oppressed by their local government. And that led him and to along with other people, create an insurrection that was called as Shays Rebellion. And this happened in Massachusetts. It protested what he perceived as very unjust economic policies and political corruption of the state legislature, in this case, Massachusetts. And what this did was it pretty much exposed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, because one of the things that we mentioned earlier was that there was a military flaw in that, and almost every state had its own militia, but the national government was unable to gather a combined military force. And when this happened, it was clear that the states, Congress, aside from not having power to actually raise money through taxes, it did not have the power to actually combine the forces and jump into the military protection of a single state or something. And George Washington himself actually called for the strengthening of the federal government in order to put down future uprisings. And one of the things that happened is that this, in a way, revived the rhetoric of the American Revolution and shaped debate over the proper scope and authority of the US government. And in order to cover all these flaws and address these problems, many people believed that it was necessary to have an element in the new government that would address these problems. Do you have a comment about that, Adam?
Do I have a comment? So first of all, I'm agreeing with everything you've said. And then second of all, let's give more background. So it's an insurrection that starts in Massachusetts. A little bit of background about Shays' Rebellion is Massachusetts elects a new governor. His name is Governor Bowdoin, and he wants to be responsible. So he realizes that we owe money to our creditors overseas. He realizes the federal government needs money. So he decides, let's do what we're supposed to do. Let's put in place taxes in Massachusetts so Massachusetts can pay the requisitions owed to the federal government. Problem is there are sometimes unintended consequences. So you mentioned Daniel Shays, who was only one of the leaders of the rebels. He gets all of the attention. And what I like about Shays is he was actually a hero that was awarded a sword by Lafayette, our friend, because he had worked very closely with as being a leader during the Revolutionary War. And how tragic is that you return from the war, you sacrifice for however many years you were in the Continental Army, and now taxes are going to foreclose on your property. So what a lot of the Shays rebels start doing, this is in 1786 to give the time frame, is they start going to courthouses and protesting and shutting down the courts. Because if you shut down the courts, then the courts can't possess your farm. They can't foreclose on you. So that actually spreads. And this happens in several counties in Massachusetts, particularly the west part of the state. So Gouverneur Morris has a great quote in the context of Shays' Rebellion and this period of time. And he says that the fate of America was suspended by a hair. And what the Governor Bowdoin has to do in Massachusetts, he has to, because he doesn't have the money for his own military for Massachusetts, because their financial situation is so poor. The federal government doesn't have the finances to send in any federal troops. We can't even supply them with supplies at the handful of forts where some of our soldiers are still located, right? So we don't really have a standing army to speak of. So Governor Bowdoin in Massachusetts has to hire a private army. They raise money from Boston merchants to try to suppress Shays' Rebellion.
And Adam, could you talk about how specifically the timing of the Shays' Rebellion and the Annapolis Convention, which led up to the Constitution, why that timing was so important and how it specifically changed things going into the Annapolis Convention?
That's an excellent point, Nicole. So timing sometimes is everything. I don't know how good my timing is tonight, but so here the timing was very fortunate. So how is the timing fortunate? So Shays' Rebellion begins to start in September of 1786. And remember, when does the Annapolis Convention happen? And the answer is September of 1786. So according to Ellis, a convention was called to address a modest matter of commercial reform, and they had failed to attract even a quorum. And Hamilton, using the occasion to announce the date of another convention, would tackle all the problems affecting the Confederation at once. And he calls this an act of bold audacity that Hamilton realizes, let's seize this moment, because people are worried about what's happening with Shays' Rebellion, and they're worried about the failure of the impost, which maybe we can talk more about. So, and what does the Annapolis Convention report say? And if we're here with the AHA Society, who do you think wrote the Annapolis Convention report in 1786? So it's Hamilton working with Madison, working with Randolph, working with some others. So it says the situation is delicate and critical, calling for the exertion of united virtue and wisdom of all the members of the Confederacy. It goes on to say that reforms were necessary. This is Hamilton being audacious and bold. Reforms are necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. I've heard historians use the analogy that you're a low-ranking boxer, you just lost a fight, and now you're challenging the champion, right? Yeah. So Hamilton is not using this as a setback; he's using this as an opportunity. So the timing was good.
Yes, and it was really interesting because the whole thing started because some of the states were having issues with river navigation rights, and they were also having issues with interstate commerce. And that's the reason why they met in Annapolis. Only 5 states represented came to the Annapolis Convention, like you mentioned, and this was something genius, because the resolution pretty much said that those questions and those issues that these states were trying to resolve could not be addressed unless the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation were properly dealt and properly discussed. And that's what the reason why the report that Alexander Hamilton wrote, which was in September 14, actually, later was adopted by Congress, and it led later to the Constitutional Convention. And we mentioned earlier how the impost was first denied by Rhode Island, and then we had New York being the one who denied, voted down the impost. But there was a good reason why they did that, and the reason why is that Clinton actually was in a good place. He had his own tariffs. Clinton was the governor of New York at the time, and the New York tariffs, and these tariffs were import tariffs, amounted for between 30 and 50% of the state income. So while Clinton wanted a really strong central government during the time in which New York was occupied by the British, that was not the case once the British were gone. He was in an excellent place. Why would he want the status quo changed? There was no reason for him. And that was a very, again, I'm going to use the word localist perspective, if you will, as opposed to the one that Hamilton had, which was very nationalist point of view. He saw how a federal impost would actually work for the benefit of the nation and bring prosperity. But there was no reason why Clinton would want to change that. And there was a famous speech that Hamilton gave on February 15, 1787. Can you talk a little bit about that, Adam, please?
Yes, so I'm agreeing, and it makes sense to talk about this very important speech. And this gets back to Nicole's point about timing. So in this time period, you've got Shays' Rebellion, which we suppress and put that down in January of 1787. And then you have a speech that Hamilton gives. And again, this is the timing, February 15th. So this is early of 1787. So Hamilton uses in his notes of one of his speeches during the ratification campaign, he uses the following phrase. He says, "The impost begat the convention." The impost begat the convention. Hamilton is saying that because of the failure of the impost, that led to, or it gave birth to, the convention. And this isn't appreciated by a lot of people because it wasn't in the musical, right? And the musical is wonderful, but it can't cover everything. That's one of our jobs, right? So Hamilton is saying the impost, the failure of the impost leads to the convention. And in this time period, going back to Nicole's timing question, the eyes of the nation are focused on New York because all the other states have approved. New York keeps voting it down. Congress sends another request to New York, get your act together, approve this impost. We need this money because the debts are coming due. The Dutch and the Netherlands and our creditors are not going to keep extending us loans. We've run out of money. It's getting desperate. Shays' Rebellion's happening. And what does New York do? New York approves the impost, but they put all kinds of conditions on it. Congress looks at these conditions because Clinton's not a dummy. This is Governor Clinton in 1786, 1787. So he doesn't want to be the obstinate stepchild. Doesn't want to be they called Rhode Island the evil sister, or the recalcitrant one. He doesn't want to be a Rhode Island, so he agrees to approve the impost, but he puts so many conditions on it that Congress decides that you really haven't accepted it. So Congress asks New York again to approve the impost in 1787, and Clinton refuses to call the New York legislature back into session to do a special session. So now we're all waiting for New York to have its regular session. And it's interesting how in this time period, 1786, 1787, Congress, meaning the federal Congress, met where? In New York. Where does the New York legislature meet? In New York. So now it comes to the time where Hamilton gets elected to the New York legislature. And why does he do this? And the answer is he's running to get New York to agree to the impost. That's the campaign issue that he's running on, is to get New York to get in line with everybody else so we can solve our financial problems. So this is the speech. I'm sorry?
But he gets voted down.
So he gives this speech, which there's all kinds of work that's been done. People should Google it. This is Hamilton's famous speech of February 15th. And it's about an hour and a half. It may have been longer. And what do you think the Clintonites, meaning the supporters who controlled the New York legislature, the Clintonite supporters of Governor Clinton do? Do they get into a debate with Hamilton? And the answer is no, probably because they can't respond to him at his level. So they basically just vote it down. They remain, there's no respect for the positions, but they have the political control, so they voted down. And I want to give you some quotes about the importance of Hamilton's speech and how this sets the stage for the Constitutional Convention. So the eyes of the nation are on New York, the eyes of the nation are on Hamilton giving the speech at the same location where the Congress meets in the same building, which means everybody who's anybody who is a member of Congress or otherwise is there listening to Hamilton's speech, which, by the way, is going to get printed in the papers all around the country, not just New York papers, but around the country. Everyone's going to read the speech. So after Hamilton gives the speech and he gets voted down, how do we know this is important? Madison writes to Jefferson that same day saying, quote, that the New York rejected the impost, which was unpropitious. Madison always is a little reticent, so it was unpropitious, right? Madison a couple of days later writes to George Washington, and this is a great quote. Madison says to George Washington, this is in mid-February, that New York had put a definitive veto on the impost. Rufus King, who's another character when we get to talking about the Constitution's cover letter. He's a member of Congress later from New York, and also he had been from Massachusetts. He says that Congress is at issue with New York, and he's a lawyer. So he's using legalistic kind of terms. At issue means you need a motion to dismiss that, and this now it's ready to be decided. So Congress is at issue at New York as Congress is being obstructed by New York. Let me give you some historians what they say about the impost. Richard Beeman, he says this brings into bold relief that New York had brought a death blow to the impost. Hamilton starts getting letters from Robert Livingston. Robert Livingston, a very important New Yorker, writes, while I console with you on the loss of the impost, I congratulate you on the laurels you acquired in fighting its battles. The mother of Robert Livingston, and we know this because we want to, sometimes you don't have access to, materials by women, but it's interesting. Margaret Livingston, who has a very important son, she writes, talking about Hamilton's speech, that here, quote, that he was considered a great man. Some say he was talked for governor. Lafayette writes Hamilton a letter. This is a couple of months after the impost speech. And what Lafayette says, I'm quoting, is a view I hear by some of our friends and in the newspapers. So we don't know from this letter by Lafayette, and this is in the April timeframe, what specific newspaper he's referring to, but you can connect the dots. So it takes time for a newspaper to make it overseas to Paris. That's where Lafayette is. And then it takes time for Lafayette's letter to come back to Hamilton. So we have every reason to think that Lafayette is congratulating Hamilton, a view I hear by some of our friends and in the newspapers. These are newspaper articles about the impost. So Hamilton, he fights the good fight. And historians, others are pointing out how this is the death knell of the Confederation. Hamilton, Henry Cabot.
Not everything was lost after that happened, because two days after the impost was voted down, which was on the same day that he actually gave this famous speech, Hamilton makes a motion to Congress to ask the states for delegates for that for that convention that is going to be happening later. And as a matter of fact, that happens. And while Hamilton originally wants to have 5 delegates to come to the Constitutional Convention, only 3 are actually decided. And this becomes a problem for Hamilton because he was thinking of having John Jay as well in delegation to the Constitutional Convention, but that doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, he ends up in a very disfavorable position because the other 2 members of his delegation were actually Lansing and Yates, who were very famous Clintonites, and actually they were very also partialized towards the Hudson Valley and the northern area of New York, while Hamilton was more towards New York City. And as I mentioned earlier, Hamilton was a nationalist, and he was pretty much the face of the anti-Clinton faction, while Lansing and Yates were the total opposite. And here you come something really important, because when they go to the Constitutional Convention, there is a delegation of 3 people. It was a very small delegation compared to some of the delegations by other states. And they understand that the minimum quota for the delegation to function is of 2 people. There can be a minimum of 2 people in order for the delegation of New York to have the proper quota. And at one point, Lansing and Yates leave, and again, their only purpose being at the convention was to make sure that the sovereignty of the state of New York was not eroded by the threat of the central government. And they are frustrated with everything they're going because they do not agree. They actually think that the delegation should only have the power and authority to make changes to the Articles of Confederation, but not to replace them altogether and put together a whole new set of government. And when they leave, that leaves Alexander Hamilton alone in the delegation. And this is something that we're going to be touching later in another point about some discoveries that we made recently. But here comes the thing. After Lansing and Yates leave, there is no more of an official quota for the delegation of the state of New York. It was only Hamilton. And so you can see that he is allowed to come to the Constitutional Convention to attend, to participate in discussions and things of the sort. But he's no longer able to vote because he's really not part of the delegation. The delegation is gone. And it's very interesting that after a period of time, that after Hamilton leaves, because Hamilton gets frustrated that, among other things, the fact that he was continuously being voted down in everything that required a vote by the delegation because he was a minority. I think Ron Chernow says that Hamilton was relegated to a minority in a dissenting delegation.
Well, and Sergio, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to make clear that the votes were by state. So it was each state had one vote. So as you're saying, it was, essentially always a null vote for him when he was within his delegation.
And there was a problem with the perception of that because he was being perceived that he was not being effective. He obviously gets frustrated. At least that's the common understanding of most historians. And then he leaves for a period of time. After he leaves, George Washington sends a letter inviting him to come back, and that's when he does. And he comes back after a long period of time, and he comes back exactly in time for the center of this discussion and the reason why we're having this talk, which was to be elected to be on the Committee of Style and Arrangement on September 8th of 1787.
Right. And keep in mind that Lansing had clerked for Yates. So these two guys had worked very closely together. They're also related to one another. And their job is to limit and to hamstrung and to sabotage Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention. Right. And the other thing is that Hamilton is also limited by the instructions that New York sends. So although New York does agree to send 3 delegates, there are limiting instructions on what New York's delegates are supposed to do. And their instructions are that they're confined, quote, to the sole and express purpose of revising the articles. So once the Virginia plan happens, Yates and Lansing are not happy anymore because you're no longer fixing the articles, you're effectively replacing the articles. So you begin to see all this tension in the New York delegation. So the most important committee, in my opinion, when we talk about the Constitution's cover letter, and there are many committees, they're all important, but my favorite committee, which I think is one of the most important, is the Committee on Style. So interrupt me if you want to throw in more details, but the date is September 8th. So they've worked out basically all the important decisions, but now they need to finalize it. So it's called the Committee on Style and Arrangement. And Sergio, as you pointed out, Hamilton had left because he really couldn't accomplish much because of his delegation. He writes to Washington. Washington says, come back. Hamilton had written to Washington and said, I think we're going to lose this golden opportunity. So Washington says, come back. So Hamilton arrives on early September, just in time. And he was working with Rufus King. So I don't think it was a coincidence. He knew to come back. But long story short, the idea is that this committee is going to polish, and there were 23 articles that have been approved during the convention, but that's not a constitution. That's just 23 separate articles that have to be molded together into a cohesive framework. So the 5 members of this committee, you want to give the name, Sergio?
Yes, that is Rufus King, that is James Madison, you have William Samuel Johnson, you have Gouverneur Morris, and you have Alexander Hamilton. However, that is not the order in which they were voted. You had the chairman, which was William Samuel Johnson. It's important to mention here that these members of the Committee of Style and Arrangement were only 5 people, and they were not like a single one from each one of the different states that were participating. They were not appointed, they were elected. And a lot of people can seem surprised at the time. Probably it happened because Hamilton was absent for so long. And then he comes back immediately to be part of this. And there are definitely a lot of other reasons that we'll be discussing another presentation that is coming later by Adam Hamilton. But remember that Hamilton is very absent. He comes back, immediately gets elected with the second most votes to participate in the Committee of Style and Arrangement. And this committee was responsible not only for giving the Constitution its final form in order to be approved by the convention, but also to put together the 2 ratification resolutions, and also this document that is so important, which is called what we refer to as the cover letter of the Constitution. It was a transmittal letter to Congress, announcing the Constitution, not only to Congress, but to the states and also to the world. And who else than to sign this letter than George Washington?
And people should look forward to future presentations about why the order that the members are appointed is important, and why Hamilton, the truant, some historians have said it's surprising, and as you mentioned, Sergio, it's surprising that this guy, he was absent basically except for August 13th. He's not there in August, right? He misses all of July, although there may have been Hamilton sightings, some people think, coming back and forth, but he doesn't speak at all in July. He's doing something else, and there are other things. That's another conversation. But why does he get appointed to this committee? And that's Sergio's point. The reason we think that Hamilton got appointed to the committee is because the cover letter, and let's talk about what the cover letter is. It's a letter which is going to transmit the Constitution, because remember, they're meeting in Philadelphia, whereas Congress in New York. So it's the letter that's going to accompany the Constitution when it travels from Philadelphia to New York. Remember, they also met behind closed doors. They had a rule of secrecy, so they could deliberate in private, and they wouldn't be shooting each other in the public. And it's a whole separate conversation, but they had secret deliberation. So this letter is going to be the first opportunity to start the public relations campaign of explaining what this document does. What is this Constitution? So it's a wonderful document, which, the rest of our evening today, we're going to talk about this cover letter. So who signs it? And the answer is, people can refer to it as a Washington letter. Sure, because Washington signed the letter, and that made sense because he was the presiding officer of the convention. So it's a Washington letter. And to answer your question, which I've been evading, who signed it? Washington, but it's unanimously approved, which makes it a very important document. So they read it out loud by paragraph, and then they vote on it, and they unanimously approve by paragraph the 5, because it's relatively short, it's 5 paragraphs. And I assume that most people listening, until I saw it in a book a couple of years ago, in an old law book from 1796, until I saw this letter and said, what the heck is this? I'd never heard of this cover letter. What are you talking about? So this is a letter signed by Washington that accompanies the Constitution to New York. And this is a letter that summarizes and tries to explain what they did that summer during some say a miraculous summer, or this so important summer when they prepare and draft the Constitution. And as Sergio also mentioned, there were a total of 4 documents that were created by the Committee on Style and Arrangement. There's the cover letter, there's the Constitution, the final draft, and I mentioned earlier that they started with 23 articles, and Gouverneur Morris is the main individual who's credited with doing this, combines and simplifies and polishes and arranges those 23 articles. If you look at the Constitution today, it's 7 articles, and one of the articles at the end doesn't really matter anymore. So he converts the 23 into 7, he reorganizes it. So that's the second thing that the committee does. And then these resolutions that deal with the ratification process. So how long does the committee have to do this? And by the way, Gouverneur Morris also writes the current version of the preamble, which everybody knows and loves. So we could spend hours talking about we the people and what that all means. But the point is that the committee meets starting on September 8th, and they present their report, which includes the final draft of the Constitution, the cover letter, and these resolutions dealing with ratification on September 12th. So they do this basically in 4 days' time is when the Committee on Style and Arrangement accomplishes these 4 very important objectives.
And it's important also to note that 4 of the 5 members of this committee were very well-known nationalists. So they, some of them had been soldiers, some of them had participating in Congress. So the perception and understanding that they had of what was going on was completely different from a lot of other heavy hitters, if you call them, that were more of localists, again, to use that word. And later you see how these positions start to get known as Federalist and Anti-Federalist. The interesting thing is that this being a letter of transmittal, this is also a letter that makes it clear why it's so important to have the Constitution adopted. And in a way, it could be said that the cover letter of the Constitution was a precursor to the Federalist Papers, because what the Federalist Papers do is to continue giving the reasons why the Constitution should be adopted and why the Constitution is so important to a healthy development of the new nation. How would you deconstruct the paragraphs of the cover letter of the Constitution, or are there any specific lines that really jump to you?
So this is a Sophie's choice. So I'm in love with this letter, and I encourage people, go online, Google the Constitution's cover letter, and there's good scholarship out there. So what are some of the high points? So the good news is it's only 5 paragraphs. The bad news is that each of them is masterful, right? So the first paragraph is the opening, where it basically says we have the honor to submit to Congress the Constitution which appears to us most advisable. So that's a single sentence, the first paragraph. But then you get into the second paragraph. I like to refer to the second paragraph as giving the reasons and justifications. Why do we need this new Constitution? And it opens with, friends of our country have long seen and desired. And I'm going to point out to you that some of you may think friends of our country, who's saying that? But friends of our country have long seen and desired that we need the power to make war. And it goes through the problems and levy money. And by the way, when it says we need to be able to levy money, what's it talking about? That's the impost. It doesn't want to use the word. Right, it doesn't want to use the word taxes, but levy money, that's taxes. We need taxes, right? And regulate commerce. So it says what we need to be able to do. Then it goes on to say that the impropriety of delegating all these powers to one body is evident. In other words, if you're going to give new powers to the federal government, you can't just give it to one body, meaning the Congress. So that gets into the idea of separation of powers. And in my view, this letter could be used as a tutorial, as a clinic in teaching civics classes, because it goes into separation of powers. It goes into John Locke, and this is social contract theory. So the third paragraph, and this is the difficulties because they're trying to be honest. They have to sell the Constitution, but they don't want to be naive about it because they know there's going to be opposition. And we'll talk later about where they know the opposition is going to come from. So the third paragraph talks about it's obviously impractical to secure all the rights of sovereignty for each state. That's federalism. It's talking about how each state can't have, total control. So it's talking about federalism. You have to find a happy medium. And it goes on, as I said, for Locke. So individuals entering into society must give up a share of their liberty. States have to give up a share of their liberty. Now he talks about, the author of the cover letter, the magnitude of the sacrifice has to depend upon the circumstances and the situation. So the sacrifice that's going to have to be made to do this, not everybody's going to be happy. Fourth paragraph, and I'm just, blazing through it. And this is probably my favorite part of the cover letter, the fourth and fifth paragraphs. So the fourth paragraph is the spirit of the cover letter and the emotion of the cover letter. So in all of our deliberations, we kept steadily in our view the greatest interest of every true American. What's important here is consolidation of the Union and our national existence, because they are worried if they don't pull this off, we're not going to get another chance again. We may splinter into separate confederations and may have at some point a civil war between the different and other European countries might get meddling in the process. So this in the fourth paragraph, they focus on this important consideration, which deeply impressed our mind. And we need more of this today. It led each state to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude. In other words, you compromise and you work together. And the Constitution is a result, quote, of a spirit of amity and mutual deference. And I think many of us can agree that without blaming any one political party, we need more of that spirit of amity and mutual deference. And remember, these founders, and sometimes they had their wives with them, not many, because they are staying home with the families, but they're living and working and sleeping together. They're eating together. They're struggling together. Right? They're not separate parties. They're working on a common mission. So the spirit of amity and mutual deference and concession, that's in paragraph 4, last paragraph. So the final paragraph mentions how we understand it's not going to give the full approbation or the full approval of every state is not to be expected. It's liable to exceptions. And then it goes on to say, and this is the ending, and you got to love this, so I'm going to say it slowly and go back and read it. Google it, and I want everybody to get a chance to read it for themselves. So the cover letter ends, that it may promote the lasting welfare of that country so dear to us all and secure her freedom and happiness is our most ardent wish. And if you look at other letters that Washington has written over time, he's the commander in chief. If he writes a letter during the war that it's his wish that something happen, then you better believe that's an order. And all the officers and the soldiers, if Washington is sending a letter with his wish, you do it. So how does this cover letter end? It is our most ardent wish. This is signed by George Washington. And by the way, it says her freedom and happiness. And maybe later at another night, we'll talk about what I think the meaning of her freedom and happiness. These people are thinking ahead. They're not just, they know there are long-term consequences to this. So I encourage everybody, this is a masterful letter that we are trying to rediscover and put back into the curriculum of you, as you will, of an important foundational document. And another point, and I'm sorry, Sergio, we'll get to some other points. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that in perspective, a lot of people may ask themselves, was this letter actually necessary? Or was there a necessity to such letter? And the answer is absolutely yes. The Constitution could have failed at any time. Actually, while the cover letter of the Constitution was the only document that was approved unanimously by everybody, every single part of the Constitution is nothing but compromises. They have to compromise all the time in order to move forward and to get anything done. And so not only was the Constitution presented with this letter that, in my opinion, particularly was an endorsement of the Constitution by George Washington, presented to Congress. Once it was presented to Congress, Congress could have changed it or asked for amendments at the time and everything, but they didn't. And they send it to the states to do that. What I'm trying to say here is that the Constitution was in such a fragile state all the time until the ratification actually happened by the states, that having a letter signed by Washington endorsing the Constitution, this was a very powerful thing that definitely had a lot of influence on some of the people who later voted for the ratification. This letter was so important that it was translated into several languages and published in many other countries. In Philadelphia, which was largely, Dutch speaking at the time, they had it translated to Dutch, and so on. You find publications in London and many other places. This letter was absolutely necessary, and it was completely vital to the ratification. And the reason why this letter is not well known nowadays is because after the purpose was achieved, which was the ratification, there was really no other reason for that letter to continue being around, and slowly faded into oblivion. Now, when you had the presentation of the cover letter, because it was always together, the cover letter and the Constitution, when they were printed in books and in many cases, and it's important to note also that the newspapers at the time had 4 pages, and they were the 4 documents: the Constitution, the 2 resolutions for the ratification, and the cover letter. So it would exactly fit in the 4 letters of the newspaper. So it was everything was printed together. And depending on the states and depending on who the printer was and how much they supported the Constitution, you could see that in many cases the cover letter was presented before in very prominent, bold characters, and in other cases it was put at the end. Again, the Constitution could have failed, that Congress could have failed at the state's ratification, but after the ratification, George Washington became president. One of the things that we wanted to share with all of you also is the fact that there is a letter that is not on Founders Online that has Alexander Hamilton mentioning the possibility of George Washington being at the head of the new government. And the timing of the letter, the date in which the letter was written is very special, right, Adam?
Yes, Sergio. So this is something we'll be discussing in future presentations, but remember the time period. So September 8th is when the Committee on Style gets appointed or elected, because the 5 members are elected. You know, on larger committees, each state gets to choose 1 delegate. On a smaller committee of 5, they're elected at large. So you got the 5 members of the committee, they're elected on the 8th, they finish their work on the 12th. And this letter that Sergio is referring to is a letter that Hamilton writes, and Sergio can go into more detail, but it's a letter he writes to an ambassador, a French minister. His name is Duché, and I'm horrible with my pronunciation. Sergio speaks more languages than I do. But Hamilton writes this letter on September 8th. So everybody think with me for a moment. That's the day the committee is appointed. That's the day that Hamilton writes this letter to the French minister. And in the letter, he says, you can share with our friend Lafayette. So he's communicating to Lafayette, and everybody loves Lafayette. Hamilton loves him. Washington loves him. You know, he's a hero. So Hamilton is basically writing a letter to Lafayette on the day that the committee is appointed. And let me quote a little bit from the letter. And you sort of summarized it, Sergio, but to quote it, and that's a whole separate story about quoting it, and maybe we'll go into more detail about that later. But he says that you may say one thing to the Marquis, which will interest him as much as anything I know. As much as anything I know. What could interest the Lafayette so much? He says there is a probability if the new Constitution is adopted, his friend, General Washington, will be brought forward as the head of it. Think about that for a second. Washington will be brought forward as the head. What's the cover letter do? The cover letter is signifying, and you said earlier, it's symbolic. It's signifying that Washington supports the Constitution. And one of the professors that is a national treasure, I mentioned him earlier, this is Professor Kaminsky from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. And Professor Kaminsky has spent an entire life preparing all the work product, all the history of the ratification. It's 35 or so volumes. It's called the Documentary History of the Ratification of the Constitution. So Professor Kaminsky says that the importance of this letter cannot be underestimated. So what is it doing? It's signifying that Washington supports the Constitution. It's also signifying and getting him on, to signing the dotted line that if it gets approved, that Washington will step forward to be the president. So it's sending another message. And Kaminsky points out, if you've supported Washington, you were for the Continental Army, you were loyal and patriotic, who are you to disagree with Washington? If these geniuses that met in Philadelphia, and we talked earlier about the delegations. New York sends 3 delegates, Virginia sends 7. Virginia sends their governor, they send Madison, they send Washington. Virginia supports the Constitution, there's some exceptions. Pennsylvania, they send 8. They send America's most famous, we could debate, is it Franklin or is it Washington? They send 8. And remember, New York only sends 3. So what's the point? The point is that this letter that's written to Lafayette is casting the die on September 8th that there's a plan here, and this is illustrating the plan. And the cover letter is central to this plan.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular letter is not on Founders Online, which is important because it illustrates how many letters of so much significance can be still out there. And we don't know. They can be in private hands, or in this case, this letter was actually in France in the National Archives. And we came to know about this letter because Max Ferrand actually wrote the papers of the Constitutional Convention, which is a masterful compilation of all the documents related to the Constitutional Convention. And then many years later, during the bicentennial, Hudson actually creates what he called the supplement to the Constitutional Convention. And in this book, this letter is mentioned. But there is something really fascinating about this letter, is that the text of the letter that is mentioned in Hudson's supplement to Max Ferrand's Constitution, Papers of the Constitution, is that the text of the letter is completely different. And so it became a whole search of us trying to find the original letter, because there was only a transcript. Turns out that what Hudson had in the book was a translation of a translation. Why? Because this letter was written to a French diplomat, and the French diplomats needed to provide their intelligence and their own understanding of what was going on in the United States and report it back to France. And so this person, this diplomat, actually translated Hamilton's letter into French, and then sent it to France. But then what we're assuming is that what Hudson got back was actually a translation to English of the French translation of the original letter by Alexander Hamilton. And it was a really fascinating thing, because I happened to go to the National Archives in Paris, and with the purpose of finding this letter, and we were able to find it. And the letter was there. We have amazing pictures. And when you're going to be able to see the recording of this talk, we will make sure to include images of some of the things that we're talking about, including this fascinating letter that, again, is not on Founders Online, but it's just extraordinary. You can imagine what we felt, seeing what we believe is the only and the first, expression by Hamilton of the possibility of Washington becoming the president in a letter. So because of time, I think we're going to be skipping the part about the ratification. I think we can get into that into a separate talk. But I would like to talk about another set of discoveries that Adam and I made recently, and this is absolutely fascinating. So like,
but before you move over, let me just, because you're a very humble guy, so I want to just, for some of the students out there that are going to be watching the video, the example I like to give is when you're playing telephone. Someone says something to someone, and then someone says it to another person, and by the time you continue down the line, the meaning has changed. And this is why Sergio goes to Paris into the French National Archives, and one day he'll write a book about how he was able to ferret it out. But you want to look at the source material. You want to look at primary sources. You don't want to look at when one historian is interpreting another historian, or that someone is translating from French into English, then back and forth, and you lose the actual specific language, which can be very meaningful. So thank you for what you've been doing, Sergio. But we're not done yet, because we've got other, so I'm sorry, continue with some of the other work that's being done.
It's interesting that you mentioned broken telephone, because that is also what happened in France. This is just an anecdote, but when I got there, the person that I had the contact with previously and has managed to get me clearance to see these documents that, by the way, were extremely important, and it took a lot to be able to have the clearance to see them in person. The only person who spoke English there was out on an emergency, and nobody spoke English, or at least that's what they said at the National Archives. And so after a couple of hours of trying to make myself understood, we figured out that there was a person that spoke Portuguese, and I speak Portuguese too. So that's the only way that we were able to communicate and be able to see. Otherwise, it would have been even harder. But moving on to the next set of discoveries. Earlier, I mentioned, and Michael Newton on the chat actually made an excellent paraphrase, something that George Washington said, that was the Constitution was signed by this and this state and Colonel Washington from New York. Colonel Hamilton from New York, yeah. And I want to go back to this thing that I mentioned earlier about what happened after the delegation was dissolved. Was Hamilton in any way representing the state of New York? Was it official? Was it legal? Did it have any actual legal basis? Everything that he did in the Constitutional Convention, including participating in the Committee of Styling Arrangements, since there was no longer any quota for his delegation. And this is really, really a fascinating thing. Was he doing it representing the state of New York, or was he doing it as an individual? And in many cases, you can see what George Washington said about, and Colonel Washington and Colonel Hamilton from New York, and understand, okay, he's mentioning the states and the individual. And one of the reasons why we kept on thinking that there had to be an answer to this somehow was the fact that you could find records on how many of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention got paid and reimbursed in many other states, but there were no records whatsoever about New York. And there have been books in the 1800s, another one in the 1900s mentioning we will never know. Those records are gone. We do not know if or how much, if the delegation from New York actually got reimbursed. And so one of the questions that we had was, these records of reimbursement actually would answer the question whether this was fully sanctioned by the state of New York, because it would be an official, acceptance of paying back the expenses after all that. And Adam was able to find the reimbursement records, not only for the Annapolis Convention, but also for the Constitutional Convention for Alexander Hamilton. And this reimbursement actually happened on May of 1888, which was the next year. So it was way after everything with the committee style and arrangement and everything had happened. He got reimbursed in full for all the days that he had to spend at the Constitutional Convention. Having those records actually made it clear, because the reimbursements are paid by the state of New York, it makes it clear that he was actually acting on behalf of the state of New York. But we had a problem, and that was that we couldn't find any records for Yates and Lansing. And so we kept on looking, and we kept on looking, and finally we were able to find them in the New York State Archives, the records of reimbursement.
Sergio, let's be clear, and you're a humble guy. There are 826 volumes, and then you've got folios, and it goes on and on. Many of these had not seen the light of day for potentially 200 years. It is Sergio who found the proof of reimbursement to Yates and Lansing. So let me tease this out a little bit. So, and that's the sleuthing to do the history research. So let's get back to where Michael Newton brought us, which is that it's George Washington's diary, and the day is important. Today is September 17th. George Washington's diary, and this is on Founders Online, on September 17th, in the year 1787, writes that we met in convention when the Constitution was received, the unanimous assent of 11 states, because Rhode Island wasn't there, so 11 states, and Colonel Hamilton from New York. Because Hamilton didn't have a delegation anymore, so Hamilton is signing, and this is Sergio's point, Hamilton is signing in his individual capacity. And one of the questions is that lawful? Does he have the authority to do anything when he's not part of a delegation? But Washington and the others let him do it. He signs. In fact, he writes the names of the states, and then the people sign, and we can debate about how that happens, because it's north to south, that's also east to west, left to right. So what's the point? The point is that Hamilton signs. He's the only signer from New York, because remember, Yates and Lansing, who are anti-federalists, don't want to have anything to do with this. And one of the questions is, will this be considered valid? And when you get the proof that they were reimbursed for their attendance at the convention, and Sergio threw out some names. So these historians over time have accumulated all these documents. So Max Ferrand, who did a lot of work from Yale, I believe in the 1910, 1911 timeframe, doing these volumes of compiling all these records, we know from Ferrand that Washington and the Virginia delegation were paid $6 a day. And we'll talk later about what does that mean, $6. New Jersey, they were paid $4 a day. Delaware, it's 40 shillings per day, but we did not have any record until a couple months ago. Did Hamilton, Yates, or Lansing get reimbursed for attending the Constitutional Convention? And lo and behold, from sleuthing in these archival records, and I want to just do a shout out to the New York State Archives. You know, some materials get lost, they get burned, and Sergio, because he's the guy that actually held them and touched them and photographed them. But the point is that they did a good job of preserving them. So there are untold records that are still out there that are part of the story that we're trying to tell.
Absolutely. And the divisiveness in New York didn't end with the ratification. Actually, New York became known as the hesitant 11th pillar. It was the 11th state to ratify. But the interesting thing about it is how divided New York was with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that even when the first presidential election happened, New York did not participate because they were completely deadlocked and couldn't do it. And even in the second presidential election, when you look at the records, they had 12 votes because they had to make a vote for president and a vote for vice president. They had George Washington had 12 votes, and Governor Clinton had 12 votes again. And they actually, you know, continue to be deadlocked. It's fascinating how, in spite of all these divisiveness and animosities and ill will in many cases, and people having completely opposite positions, something like the Constitution was able to exist. As I mentioned earlier, it was a work of many compromises, and one of the things that seemed to be over everything was the spirit of amity and mutual deference that Adam Levinson mentioned, paraphrasing the language of the cover of the cover letter of the Constitution. And here comes to wrap this. Where is the cover letter right now? Is there any records out there that can tell us where it is, Adam?
So I don't know that I want to answer because we want to give some suspense, but I'll answer anyway. So the answer is, what is the cover letter? And the cover letter was printed in newspapers. Whenever the Constitution was printed, there were about 100 newspapers, give or take, at the time of the convention. So the newspapers all print the Constitution, they print the cover letter, they print the resolution. It was printed in law books. It was printed in various locations that we don't have time to talk about. But you know, when you go to the National Archives, it's called the Chamber of Freedoms. You have the Constitution, you have the Bill of Rights on one side of the room, you have other important documents, like sometimes the Gettysburg Address, etc. My thesis with Sergio is that if we had the signed copy, and here's the answer, we don't have the signed copy. We have the printed copies. We have a draft copy in Gouverneur Morris's handwriting, but we don't have the Washington signed copy of the cover letter. So the hunt is on, and that's a story to be continued. And I want to give another minute before we wrap up on another. I want to give a quote. So in Federalist No. 8, Hamilton says, "A nation without a national government is an awful spectacle." And in Federalist No. 1, and many people have probably heard this before, Hamilton says that whether societies are equally capable and really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they're forced or destined to depend upon political constitutions on accident and force, and I'm butchering this. You know, he's saying, can we do this? Can we create our own government and live with a government of our choice? Or do we wind up subject to fate? And I encourage people, look at Federalist No. 1, and it's a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Absolutely. We do have a comment from Tommy Maddock saying, "Over and above the question of Hamilton's legality as a representative signer, I believe it was Joseph Ellis who made the point that the entire replacement of the Articles of Confederation was exceeding the official limits for the convention, but they did it anyway. Yates and Lansing were against it and they left. So overall, they were kind of making up the rules as they went along, I think. Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
When the delegation was created, there was no language in the resolution that decided what was the minimum quota for the delegation to happen, but it was the understanding between the three of them that a minimum of 2 of them was necessary in order to keep the quota. Now, you can also read, and I am sorry, I cannot paraphrase or tell you exactly what it is, but I believe that the Constitutional Convention at some point, either in May or June, actually had its own rule that a minimum of 2 delegates per delegation was needed in order to have a proper quota. So that's what I know about that.
So Sergio, I'm agreeing with you. There are multiple problems that they had. The Articles requires 13 states to agree. Rhode Island doesn't even bother to show up. right? And the instructions from Congress, and some of the different states had different instructions to their delegates, and question whether or not the delegates have to follow their instructions. What does that mean? But the February 21 instructions from Congress limited what they were supposed to do to, quote, the sole and express purpose of revising the articles. And I don't remember the name of the commenter, but if they're limited to the sole and express purpose of revising the articles, that's not what they did. They dumped the articles in the garbage and they came up with something new and better. And Hamilton's philosophy and his explanation for this is, we didn't have another choice. And when you're given a job, you have to do the job. You can't be limited by technicalities. So he has foresight to get the job accomplished.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And yes, he agrees as well. That's entirely it. I do want to mention that both of you have shared so much fascinating information. And of course, I know there's a lot more to come. I do want to encourage everyone that if they'd like to learn more in depth behind a lot of the information that was shared tonight, please visit Adam Levinson's website at statutesandstories.com. And you can really get into a lot of the detail, hear more quotes, more primary sources, as you can see we're all a fan of, and really dive more into the story and the journey that Adam and Sergio have been on in making these incredible discoveries that, again, I think they're both being quite humble that even the archivists at the New York State Archives mentioned that no one had ever looked into those documents, those folios that they had on site, and that they're very excited to see these discoveries being made. So all a part of this conversation of rediscovering the cover letter, its importance, and then some of the story behind it that's been lost, especially in the New York story, which was such an important state in the discussion around the Constitution, in the conversation of ratification, if New York would be joining the government under the Constitution, and then of course from the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, a more in-depth look at what Hamilton's role was. We knew a lot of this important information, but it's very exciting to discover even more details about this part of Hamilton's life and what it meant and how we can really study it further. So it's really wonderful. And I want to encourage you all again to visit the website. And then we will be hosting more in-depth conversations about the cover letter and Hamilton's role specifically in the cover letter. And so we will be posting about that as a recorded talk, but it's been such a pleasure to have both of you live, to come together with our members and supporters live, to have a conversation about this, to dive in to what was the impetus for the Constitution, about the Constitution, and then to really talk about a story so unique to the Constitution on Constitution Day. So I hope you all enjoyed a lot of this new information and a new perspective in coming together to celebrate Constitution Day. And again, we're so glad to have you here to really celebrate this special day in a special way. So thank you all. And for any of you all that would like more information, we do welcome you to visit the AHA Society website, theahasociety.org, and to follow our social media to stay up to date about those upcoming events and to continue learning more about Alexander Hamilton in the US Constitution. So thank you again to Sergio, thank you again to Adam, and thank you to you all. And I wish you all a very happy Constitution Day.
Happy birthday, Constitution.